So in the classic code, the typical practitioner focusing on, in their practice, in their disciplined practice to come to a mastery, will typically, when working beside a client who wishes to make a change in some context, will literally ask that person at the conscious level, what would you prefer to do? What new behaviors? How would you like to change the quality of your experience? All of these questions are answerable at the conscious level. In the actual practice by Bandler and myself, what we did, if we used those interrogatories, was to recognize that asking those questions of the conscious mind would elicit certain kinds of responses, typically nominalizations, very big words which would take some time to specify. We rarely use specification patterns in that particular niche. What we did was recognize that consciously asking someone to respond to a complex question like how would you prefer to be different in this context would provoke a nonverbal response. The nonverbal response, as any of you who have worked in NLP patterns at all, would have a nonverbal component. Inside the nonverbal component there would be parts of the nonverbal response which would be by the quality of movement, by the other characteristics, be identified by someone who is trained in hypnosis as coming directly from the unconscious. So the distinction here is in the nonverbal response to a question, can you recognize which part of the nonverbals are a direct signal coming from the unconscious, which declares its opinion about the answer that's being given consciously, and what parts are not? To ask such question incurs a major responsibility on the part of the practitioner to be able to make this sorting, this distinction between messages from the unconscious and simply accompanying nonverbals. And to use that calibration skill to know whether the conscious answer to the question by the client is in fact in agreement with the unconscious opinion. If in fact these two, by calibration, are not coordinated, they're not aligned, then the immediate requirement by the practitioner in this case will be to achieve through some manipulation an alignment of those two prior to actually making the intervention. Resistance is the name of what people have learned to call in the traditional change work for the failure to recognize these unconscious signals, or the failure to be able to create the alignment necessary to move forward. In a contest of the wills, so to speak, between conscious and unconscious, I know where I put my bets, and I'm certainly that you do as well. Now, in order to lower the threshold and to make, to simplify the ability of a practitioner to appreciate what the unconscious prefers in the set of choices that are being created, in the new code we've simply reassigned the responsibility to the unconscious. And we do this by changing the question from a question about behavior or resource to a question about state. That is, the leverage point of the new code is state as opposed to behavior. There are many reasons for this. But largely, the way we work the system in the new code is simply to use some activity, some game, which has no inherent content, which through the activation of both hemispheres simultaneously, all input channels, all expressive output channels, all representational systems, a parallel process is typical of these activities. There's two tasks being carried out at the same time, and the design, which can be quite intricate or quite simple depending on your preferences, has as its consequence the generation of a high-performance state. Such high-performance states are then connected intimately with the images and the sounds of the context of application that the person wishes to introduce change into. Notice that in this method, at the end of the intervention with the practitioner, the client knows directly by the sensing, both kinesthetic, visual, and auditory, in all three major systems, that something of importance has shifted. Their perceptions of the context has shifted towards something where, if they were to be asked, which we don't, They would describe themselves as feeling far more confident, that they feel as if they were dominating a context where previously they had felt dominated by the context. Notice that in the new code we never discuss the problem. The problem in the new code is defined in a soundbite as the problem is not the problem is the state with which the client approaches the context where the problem resides, where it's situated. At the end of this intervention, as I said, the client knows something has shifted, and sensing direct is quite profound. They don't know, typically, what new behaviors specifically they'll engage in when they reach the context. By assigning the responsibility for the selection of new behaviors and resources to the unconscious, and is triggered only by actually entering into the context of application subsequent to the practitioner's intervention, the client goes into what we call a know-nothing state, very much associated with know-nothing states we use for purposes of NLP modeling itself. The typical and quite startling result is that the client at the end of the intervention walks away knowing something has happened, not being conscious about what precisely, how they will be different. When they wander in the real world into that context, or any context that shares a significant number of visual and auditory stimuli, the ones that define the context of application initially, there is a triggering of the high performance state once again. The shifts physiologically are detectable. No conscious attention is required by the client for this to occur. This is taken care of at the unconscious level by the intervention previously by the practitioner. At this point, the client senses a shift in their state into this high performance state, and now flow from this particular high performance state a series of new behaviors which contain resources which are ideally situated with respect to addressing the details and the nuances of the actual context as they find it. Notice, here's another distinction. If, as a client, I consciously select the resources and I consciously select the new behaviors, I'm going to rehearse those behaviors. I'm going to activate those resources as part of the intervention. When I do this, I'm setting up, by the rehearsal, a discrepancy between the context as envisioned by me here and what I'll actually find when I get to the context in the real world. By setting up these new behaviors and resources ahead of time, and especially consciously, I'm rehearsing a set of filters. I'm installing filters such that when I arrive in the actual context, those filters will allow pass only those parts of the actual context which are congruent with the filters which have been installed. Therefore, I'm quite likely to miss important aspects of the actual context because there will always be a discrepancy between the imagined rehearsed context projected for the purposes of the intervention and the actual context when you arrive. So I am, in a sense, installing filters which remove essential information from my input through this filtering if I use a classic code approach. So there's always that discrepancy between the rehearsed behavior and the behavior most appropriate. In the new code, since no behavior is ever explicated, and this is simply a shift into a high performance state, at that point, without the pre-filters which come from the classic code, the new code technique stimulates the activation of the high performance state. The high performance state without any preset filters now simply goes into a mode of producing the appropriate sets of responses which will allow the person to succeed given their intention in this context.